We are in the 27th chapter of Isaiah. We'd gotten down to verse 9, but really want to go back to verse 7 and at least start there very briefly, and before we continue on in verse 9. Because verse 9 is a conclusion that takes place from verses 7 and verse 8. And I titled this section, verses 7 through 11, as God's people shall no more be idolaters. And he tells them, hath he smitten him? As he smote those that smote him, or as he slain according to the slaughter of them that are slain by him? In measure when it shooteth forth, thou wilt debate it. He stayeth his rough wind in the day of the east wind. In other words, God is not going to punish Israel as severely as he did those that he used to punish Israel. Specifically, you could go back to the Assyrians and the Babylonians, that their punishment was going to be far greater than that of Israel, even though God had used them in order to punish Israel. And so in verse 9, again, this becomes a conclusion from what he has said in these previous two verses, that by this, therefore, shall the iniquity of Jacob be purged. And this is all the fruit to take away his sin. When he maketh all the stones of the altar as chalk stones that are beaten in sunder, the groves and images shall not stand up. The iniquity of Jacob is going to be purged. It's going to be forgiven. A couple of other words, atoned for, or there's the word expiated. It's removed. It's gone. Their sin is covered from the eyes of God. And those sins or those iniquities have been dealt with so completely that it no longer remains an object of God's condemnation. That's really what forgiveness is all about. We remember and use Hebrews, the 8th chapter, and specifically verse 13, where their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. And we use the trite statement, when God forgives, he forgets. Quick question on that. How can an all-knowing being forget anything? What does it mean, though? Well, it is the same thing that he's talking about here. There's really no difference in the meaning of that. That the sins have been dealt with. It's been purged. God is not going to bring it up in the sense that he is going to punish them again, because it's been dealt with. The problem that we have so many times in forgiving is that something will happen years later And what do? I remember when when that happens, you can just state real quick, you've never forgiven me. What happens if we do not forgive others? We're not forgiven.
That's the reason they go to rules in the Bible. Teach us not to do that kind of stuff.
Well, the specific, it states us specifically that when we do not forgive, God will not forgive us. And so, it might even be in our mind, certainly God cannot forget anything, but He's not going to bring it up in such a way as to hold it against that individual. Okay, Henry. You don't hold it against them. You don't bring it up against them. That's the idea of forgiveness. That's the way God does it. I was going to mention the aspect of, did God ever record any sins of anyone in the Bible that He had forgiven? Well, here's some here. He is talking about their sin, yet they're going to be purged. If they're purged, how can He bring them up again? Well, He's not holding it against them. He's recording history. I was thinking specifically of Paul, the apostle. Paul probably had a more difficult time forgiving himself than God did. Do we ever have that problem? Forgiving ourselves? David was asking for forgiveness in that sense. But we do have a problem forgiving ourselves. I heard someone, and I hope they never presented it in the way in which they did in a teaching situation, because it would have been rather harsh to the individual that's that's just having difficulty forgiving themselves. Don't you believe God? Don't you trust God? God forgave you. Don't you believe Him? Don't you trust Him? Well, there is an element of truth to that. If God forgives us, then we need to learn to forgive ourselves. We will remember. God remembers it. That's why my point was with Paul, for example. the situation with Paul, that's why I brought him up. Was Paul forgiven? Yes. Did God record the sins of Paul? Yes. After that Paul had been forgiven? Yes. He had not forgotten it in that sense, but he certainly wasn't going to hold it against Paul because they had been forgiven. We need to learn to forgive ourselves in that we do not allow, and well, again, let me use Paul as an example. Did Paul ever mention the fact of what he had done before? Plenty of times, didn't he? There's the one statement, the chiefest of sinners. Why? Because of what I did before, but he had been forgiven of that. Now then, how did he use it, though? He did use it as an example to teach others, because there where he refers to himself as the chiefest of sinners, but I obtained mercy. What's he showing? He's teaching others that you can have mercy even as I did, and I was the chief of sinners because of all that I did. And I'll get to both of you. So, but there's also the aspect of Philippians 3rd chapter. Can I mention that, Paul, since your invitation is over that? Forgetting those things that are behind. Well, did he totally forget them? No, but he used them for his profit, to look to those things that are in the future. And so, yes, he remembered them, but he used them to learn. He used them as an impetus to do what is right. And that's what we've got to do. We sin, we repent, we're forgiven. Do we forget about it? No, we use it. We use it to our advantage because we learn from it. We learn not to repeat the same mistakes. We learn how to maybe avoid the temptation. And so we use those things and we continue forward. The problem is when we use those things and become guilt-ridden, and so guilt-ridden that we can't do things in the future. And that's what we cannot allow. Okay, Carl, you were first, and then Dale.
And that's what I was going to touch on. You don't forget things for a reason, so you don't do the same mistakes, or and people, a lot of people are habitual offenders. So just forgive somebody, it's all right, but you wouldn't just forget it because depending on what they did,
I think you say repeat offenders, habitual offenders many times, of the same problems and the same sins. And how many of us, looking at that individual who makes that same mistake over and over and over, and we start thinking he never repented. Is that right? Well, no, it's not necessarily. It might be. It could be possible, but that's not what we ought to be thinking. We ought to be forgiving and then helping them to overcome the sin. And that's where you use those things, not forget them, but use them to our advantage.
John the Baptist in Matthew 3:8 said, "Bring forth therefore fruits meet for repentance." And did Paul ever do that in 2 Corinthians 11?
Well, of course, he brought forth his entire life after his conversion was bringing forth fruit meet for repentance.
And God, through the Holy Spirit, revealed that, because that's what will help you forgive yourself more. When you get more leverage and you do more right over and over and over again, it gives you more leverage to help you, psychologically not dwell on it,
You can use good or evil as an impetus to help out in overcoming sin and temptation. And we have to use both. We learn from our experiences.
Since you drew by invitation, Paul reminded the Ephesians, remember you once were.
Sure.
Without Christ, lost, alienated. You would remind them that don't go back into that.
Did the same thing with the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 6. And such were some of you. But you've washed, sanctified, justified. So here you see the same idea of God's forgiveness, that their sins are going to be covered from the eyes of God in such a way that He's not going to hold those sins against them any longer. They're not going to be the object of God's condemnation. They're now the object of His rewards. He mentions is all the fruit to take away his sins. The fruit of the severe judgment would be and was going to be that idolatry was going to be taken away and destroyed. The stones of the altar were idols that are going to be pulverized and beaten and sundered. They're going to be totally destroyed. The altars or the idols are going total destruction of those idols. Pulpit commentary states that he maketh all the stones as the altar chalk stones. And they say a calcining of the stones into lime is probably intended. It was usual to subject the idolatrous objects to the action of fire and then to stamp them into powder. And they reference 2 Kings 23, verse 4, 6, 11, 12, 15, etc. So they were going to burn those idols, destroy them, stamp them into powder, and thus chalk stones. He maketh all the stones of the altar as chalk stones that are beaten in sunder.
Like you could burn them and then ram them with one of those siege works machines, crush them in the stout powder.
Did they have those back then?
Well, they did. I mean, the Babylonian period, I don't know whether Jerusalem had them. I ain't read history enough to know that.
Well, maybe you can do that for next week.
Really?
Let us know. However they did it, they were going to destroy them totally. The groves and images in the King James, the New King James has wooden images and incense altars shall not stand. I think the American standard is probably the best, though. The Asherim and the sun images shall rise no more. Asherim is the plural form of Asherah. Asherah was the goddess of worship, or worshipped by the Canaanites, and specifically forbidden by God. If you look at, someone read Deuteronomy, the 16th chapter and verse 21. Okay, King James has plant thee a grove of any trees. It's dealing with the Asherah, that Canaanite worship, forbidden by God. So they were going to so completely destroy the idols and the idolatry that it would never rise again. It shall not stand up. Okay, Dale.
A century or so after Isaiah made that statement, Zechariah said, "It shall come to pass in that day, said the Lord, I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land. They shall no more be remembered," and etc.
Okay. The interesting thing is that after the Babylonian captivity, idolatry was never associated with the Israelites after that. The purpose in God's bringing judgment upon them was to destroy the idolatry, make it where it shall not stand up. It would cease. And that's what took place. They went into captivity. They came back from that captivity, never again associating idolatry with the Israelites. Makes you wonder why all of the previous captivities that they had gone into, that it didn't do that way back then. Period of the judges, for example. You had 15 judges. What is it? Oppressions, in which they finally cried to God, and he sends a judge, a deliverer for them. 15 judges to deliver them from oppression. Why didn't it cause them to think at that time, hey, this idol worship isn't so good? But they didn't seem to do that. But now then, with the Babylonian captivity, it accomplishes that purpose. So in verse 10, he says, "Yet the defenced city shall be desolate, and the habitation forsaken, and left like a wilderness. There shall the calf feed, and there shall he lie down, and consume the branches thereof." The defenced city. What city is that? A lot of speculation. Some say it's Babylon. Some say it's Samaria. Some say it's Judah. There's probably a whole bunch of other speculations as to what the defense city is. Probably it has reference to Jerusalem. But in principle, it would apply to any defense city, wouldn't it? It really wouldn't make any difference what city it was, a defense city. And here's what's going to take place. For a time, it's going to be forsaken. It's going to be left desolate, or like a wilderness. So there's utter desolation there. And it's a place where animals are going to roam. The illustration that he uses in regards to the animal, the calf feed, and there shall he lie down and consume the branches thereof, is again an illustration of complete desolation. That these calves are going to eat the branches or the twigs of the vines for lack of better food or herbage. So for lack of better food, here they're eating this inferior stuff because the desolation has been so complete. So in verse 11, he adds that when the boughs thereof are withered, they shall be broken off. The women come and set them on fire, for it is a people of no understanding. Therefore, he that made them will not have mercy on them, and he that formed them will show them no favor. The basis for this metaphor might go back to Isaiah chapter 5 and verses 1 through 7, where he writes, "Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. And he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looketh that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard, that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. And now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the walls thereof, and it shall be trodden down. And I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looketh for judgment, but behold oppression, for righteousness, but behold a cry." That becomes the basis for what he writes here. This bough would be the main branch of the tree, but it's rotten and worthless. What happens when the main trunk of a tree gets rotten? The whole tree is going to come down. You had some first-hand experience on that, huh? And it doesn't just wither away, though, does it? What happens? The limbs will start falling off, and pretty soon, if there's a strong wind, what happens? Over that thing goes. And whatever is under it is going to be destroyed.
And then it falls on your leg road and you get hurt.
Well, limbs fall. They really are of no value. Can you imagine trying to sell to someone who's buying wood, "Look at this tree. Well, it's rotten." "Yeah, but don't you want to buy it? It'll make you a good house, right?" Well, it's worthless. Has no value anymore, except to break it off, gather it, use it for firewood, maybe. It specifies here that the women come and set them on fire. It was probably the women's work to collect fuel and kindling for fire, and especially for cooking fires. So here they are going out, the women, and they're getting the firewood. The women come and set them on fire. Jerusalem, the Israelites in general, were desolate. They were weak. They were being broken off for the fire. Now then, Isaiah gives us, or God gives them, the reason for that, though. The reason they are in this condition is because they are a people of no understanding. Someone read Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 3. We'll look at a few verses along this line. Isaiah 1 and verse 3. Okay, Israel does not know. They don't consider. They should have known God, they didn't. Someone read Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 13. Okay, they've gone into captivity. Why? No knowledge. And of course, the meaning is they have no knowledge of God. Let's just kind of stop there for a second, and we'll read a couple other passages. But did they have an excuse for not knowing? Not a bit of excuse, did they? Again, Isaiah chapter 5, that entire section that we just read, that God had done all of these things for Israel, his vines, and they produced wild grapes, he says there in Isaiah chapter 5. They did not know him, even though he had done all of these things for them. Question though, did they have no knowledge of God? It says that they had no knowledge. Did they have any knowledge? Did they have any knowledge of God? They had knowledge of things that he had done for them. They had knowledge of God bringing them out of Egypt and the plagues that took place in Egypt. They would have known those things. So when he says that there is no knowledge, what does it mean? Well, they didn't truly believe, but they did not apply those things to their lives to make them live in accordance with what God wanted them to do. That's what it boils down to. They had no respect for his word. It wasn't that that they didn't have any knowledge of his word. It was they didn't respect it. They didn't care what God said. And as a result, they were going to go into captivity. Okay, Dale.
It says later on below verse 13 in Isaiah 5, which you referred to, later on down in the chapter, it says, woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity and sin, as it were, with a cart row, that say, let him make speed and hasten his work, and they get sarcastic and stuff, so they're not taking the word of God seriously. They're too confused and stuff, you know?
Again, they do not respect God's word. At least they did not respect it in the sense that they would not apply it to their lives. God said to do these things. They didn't care whether they did them or not. They lived contrary to those things. And so there was no knowledge from the standpoint that that knowledge permeated their life. It's not necessarily that they did not have any knowledge whatsoever. Someone read Jeremiah 5 and verse 21. Okay, they have eyes, they have ears, but they didn't use them. So again, they had a knowledge, but they didn't use that knowledge. They did not apply what God said to their life. So they were foolish people without understanding. And probably the passage that's most often used would be Hosea 4 and verse 6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because thou hast rejected knowledge. I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of, God, of thy God. I will also forget thy children. So here, they rejected knowledge. In other words, they knew it, but they were not going to live according to it. Aren't we told that they refused to have God in their knowledge? That they wanted to live like they wanted to live? It wasn't, in Psalm 14 and verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Years ago, someone, in explaining that verse, and I've always remembered this, that it did not necessarily mean that they did not believe that God exists. But instead, they were saying, no God for me. They couldn't deny his existence, but I don't want to live that way. I don't want to do those things. No God for me. I want to live like I want to live. I want to do the things that I want to do. So no God for me. I don't know if that's accurate in regards to an accurate translation, but it certainly would be applicable in relationship to the people that he's dealing with. They've gone astray because they want to live their own life. Yeah. Did they actually physically hear what he said and what he taught? Well, sure they did. Did it have any effect upon their life? No, because they didn't want it to. Well, but here they have no understanding. I look at our society here in the United States today, and to use the term that's used, or used to be used, that America is a Christian nation. Now then, we should know, if we don't, that the only nation that is a Christian nation is the church. It is not a physical nation today. America never was a Christian nation in that sense. But it was founded upon Christian principles, and so based upon that, America was a Christian nation. Go around our nation nowadays, in our society, and especially young people, the college-age people and such. How many have any concept as to anything about the Bible or God? It is so minuscule that what God says here, there's no understanding. They probably had a whole lot better understanding than what our society today is. I think a good illustration of that is how many young people live together without the benefit of marriage and see absolutely nothing wrong with it, as if it's just perfectly acceptable. Or committing the fornication that is so prevalent among young people today. Why? Well, number one, they don't know. They've never been taught. The Bible has been excluded from their life from the time in which they were born because their parents had excluded it from their life. And as a result, they don't know. I sort of say, how do you deal with someone like that? You have to start it just like they were a small child and start teaching them the principles of God's Word. The good thing about that, you don't have to unteach them error because they don't know the denominational error. And so from that standpoint, it becomes easier. But our society can certainly be described in those same terms that we've just read in these passages. That we have no knowledge, we rejected knowledge, we have no understanding. They did not understand the true nature of God and His demands as to obedience to His Word, and that failure to obey those led to destruction. Our society does not know the nature of God, does not know that He demands obedience, and that failure to obey Him is going to lead to destruction, and at death, eternal destruction. People don't know. Carl, you want?
I thought the best one was when we had our lectureship on the minor and major prophets, and the young people thought that was a business course.
I hadn't heard that, but a business course on major and minor prophets.
Here a couple of days ago, though, I had a real good. Someone was trying to convince me that a cell phone was a miracle.
That a cell phone was a miracle. Well, that comes as a great result of the misuse of the term miracle today. So many things are a miracle today that it's just common things are miracles. Good football catch is a miracle. Birth of a baby is a miracle. You get well from being sick, it's a miracle. You got miracles coming out of our ears today, according to what some would believe. Those are not, of course, Bible miracles. It is the worldly use of the term miracle. If you can do it in about 5 seconds, Dale, since it's saying bell.
That fish, birds, bacteria, and tons of other life forms have magnetite in their brains, and they're able to be guided by that. Now, how did that get installed in them? Accidentally? Sure wasn't that mutation of natural selection.
Okay.
To the nth degree.
Well, we will stop there and, Lord willing, next time pick up in verse 11.